As federal Conservatives continue their election post-mortem, Andrew Scheer's campaign manager is opening up about what he thinks happened. Hamish Marshall says it all came down to 500,000 votes. The CBC's polls analyst Eric Grenier is here to explain. Mr. Marshall told you that, Eric. Tell me a bit more about what took him by surprise, I guess.
Yeah, I spoke to him earlier this week, and he told me that at the beginning of the campaign, the Conservatives were expecting, by his own estimates, he has a model that tries to estimate what turnout will be, was that it was going to be somewhere around 63 or 64%. In the end, it turned out to be about 66%. And that made the difference of about 550,000 votes. And according to Hamish Marshall, about 220,000 of them, voters that they weren't expecting to turn out, came out in Alberta and Saskatchewan, another 200,000 in Ontario, and 100,000 in Quebec. And in a lot of those races, it could have made a significant difference in terms of the outcome.
Yeah, what kind of impact does he estimate, I guess, that had on the outcome?
Well, he says the 220,000 in Alberta and Saskatchewan, no surprise, they all broke to the Conservatives. And when you see the results, it does actually back that up, because the pollsters were suggesting that the Conservatives would do quite a bit worse, still win almost all the seats, but quite a bit worse in terms of the popular vote. The Conservatives ended up beating their polls in the prairies in Alberta by almost 10 points on average. So you do see that a lot of voters did potentially go out to vote for the Conservatives that maybe were not expecting to earlier on. And in Ontario, that also, according to Hamish Marshall, it broke towards the Liberals, and that would have made a difference in a lot of the races that were running close between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And in Quebec, also broke towards the Liberals. And there are actually about 6 ridings in Quebec where the Liberals were able to win by less than a margin of 1,000 votes. And in almost all of those, it was the Bloc Québécois that was a very close second or third. So in a lot of those races, it was the Liberals that might have emerged on election day with a few more votes, just enough to win those seats from the Bloc. A lot of us going into that election night expected the Bloc to do maybe a little bit better, maybe emerge with more seats than the Liberals in Quebec. And it seems that in the end, it was not the case. And the Liberals got the votes where they needed.
How does that match up with the narrative that kind of emerged out of the election, and that is that the Liberals were able to win this because of Ontario? It sounds like that's somewhat similar.
Yeah, because we weren't expecting the kind of margins that we saw in the Greater Toronto area between the Liberals and the Conservatives, that really only a handful of seats changed hands, that the Liberals were able to retain almost all of the gains that they'd made in the 2015 election, and that made a big difference. And I think that a lot of the projections that we saw from pollsters at the end of the campaign, and also from what we were hearing sometimes from Conservatives and sometimes from New Democrats, was that there was going to be a lot more hotly contested races in that area. And in the end, the Liberals were able to sweep Toronto again and more or less recreate the coalition of voters that they won a majority government with in Ontario. Didn't happen to them in Western Canada. And one of the things that Hamish Marshall was mentioning was that by the end of the campaign, that enthusiasm gap had been closed between the Conservatives and the Liberals. That at the beginning of the campaign, if you talk to a Conservative voter, they were much more certain about their choice. They were much more likely to go out and vote. And Liberals, New Democrats, Greens, less likely. By the end of the campaign, he says that in Ontario in particular, that gap that the Conservatives had, that advantage, that turnout advantage, just disappeared. And by the end of the campaign, people who were planning to vote not for the Conservatives were just as likely to be certain of their intention of doing that as Conservatives were to vote for the Conservative Party.
And did that have something to do with the messaging over the last week, which was very much about strategic voting?
I think so. I mean, Marshall says that part of it was the Liberals making the case that the Conservatives were going to come to power, so progressive voters had to get behind the Liberal Party. Of course, you know, there's lots of factors that were at play. Andrew Scheer's positions on gay marriage and abortion probably played out a lot more differently in the Greater Toronto area and Quebec.
We know they did. The campaign managers from all those areas.
Yes, exactly. So we know that those factors were at play as well. But certainly in the last week of the campaign, it does seem like the Liberals were able to shore up some of their advantages, and that was what put them over the edge in terms of winning not just a few more seats than the Conservatives, but quite a few more seats than the Conservatives.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Eric. Appreciate the CBC's polls analyst, Eric Grenier. We're back with the Power Panel, Supriya, Tim, Kathleen, and Marika. Earlier, our CBC polls analyst, Eric Grenier, took us through the federal election turnout numbers. Kathleen, I'll start with you. He was essentially reflecting what the Conservatives campaign manager, Hamish Marshall, had told him, which was that there was much higher than anticipated turnout, and they feel like that influenced the outcome of the election for them.
The only thing that I think, listen, I have great respect, like everyone who works in politics and who's a strategist at that level knows what they're talking about. But I am surprised by one comment that, the Conservatives went in predicting less than the turnout was in 2015. And certainly there was a bump in 2015, but you would always kind of consider that the new benchmark. And so what it tells me is maybe they were looking to try to suppress some vote, right? Like, how can you suppress some vote out there and actually demotivate Liberals to sit on their hands or stay at home as opposed to coming out? And they weren't successful enough in doing that. And yes, maybe you're wanting to jump in. I can hear you, but maybe in Alberta and some parts of the West, but clearly, the Liberals motivated people in the cities, in Toronto, in Vancouver, and obviously, and didn't turn over the Atlantic region. So I found that kind of interesting about what he was saying, because normally you start with what the vote is, and then you figure out what you need to get, what your marks are within there. But
although there had been a ton of discussion, even outside. I mean, I take your point, but there had been a lot of discussion even among our panels about if that was a possibility, only because the level of enthusiasm, according to the polls, seemed to be depleted so much for the Liberals. And we know that in 2015, what was so crucial to their win was the bump in turnout.
For sure. And that enthusiasm gap, which was a problem, for instance, in the 2016 campaign with Hillary, right? There was a lack of enthusiasm to vote for her. I think that the Conservatives really read that there'd be a lack of enthusiasm to vote for Trudeau again. And certainly there was in pockets, but people still came out, and he still secured in big numbers and still, basically secured a very firm minority.
Yeah, look, I have a good regard for Hamish as well, and I think he did, I think in history will show he's done as well as he could have with the candidate that he had, and that's not to be cruel to Mr. Scheer. There's enough people that are being cruel to him right now, but if you talked to Hamish before the campaign, he would have told you, and Marika probably heard this, as did you, Vashi, that when they did focus testing on him, he wasn't seen, shock, as an exciting character, that one of his assets was he was, bland compared to the other guy. So if you're bland compared to the other guy and enthusiasm starts to matter, it's hard to imagine that you can close the enthusiasm gap. And the other issue with that is it's hard to close an enthusiasm gap if what you're running on is hoping that the other side will fail and a campaign practices and of another era. Like, they did do some things that got them a little better on climate change, but there's, as we all know, a long way to go there. And also the brand challenges that he had. It was really strongly negative for him to have that whole issue about his American citizenship come up in the end, because that cut right to the core of, you're saying Justin Trudeau's not as advertised. And now this happens in the last few days. So again, that's going to drain enthusiasm. Yes, Conservatives often hope that the voter turnout is lower, but they have to change that particular model if they want to win in the future.
Supriya, what do you think?
So I'm going to say one thing, and maybe it's because motherhood has made me soft, but I would just say that it's like a little bit, somewhat depressing that the electoral strategy for the Conservatives hinges on a depressed turnout. We should be encouraging people to vote. I thought it was a good news story that more Canadians voted at advanced or during the advanced polling period. That is good. We want people to vote. We want people to be engaged and to have a say in our democracy. But what I think all parties and ultimately pollsters need to start realizing is that there is a demographic shift that has already happened. Millennials now make up the largest voting bloc. We outnumber boomers. Older millennials, such as myself, have the same sort of concerns as like the olds do in terms of saving.
She talking about you and I, Kathleen? Are we like the olds?
No,
never.
Ageism again.
So as much as I still care about taxes or how I'm going to save for retirement, I also equally care about the environment. I care about my LGBTQ friends and family who are perhaps not getting the amount of respect from certain candidates that they should be getting. And I think ultimately this is what is going to end up driving votes. And if we don't see some sort of pivotal changes, and this isn't just at the Conservatives, but I think for all parties, they're going to be sorely disappointed.
Marika?
I think one of the things I've heard since the election is that there were challenges or maybe more blind spots because Hamish Marshall was and the campaign manager and also the pollster, and so there weren't other people. You disagree with that, but that's one of the things I keep hearing from Conservatives, and so I kind of wonder, would those sort of missed guesses or misestimates still have happened if that wasn't the case? That's one of the things I think that we'll find out from John Baird's review of the party, but that's one of the questions that stands.
Yeah, I mean, Kathleen knows this better than I do. David Hurley, who Kathleen's done a lot of work with, has served in that role before, and I think we'll see what Mr. Baird's review says, but I don't think that was the glaring. I know you're not saying that, but it wasn't as big a weakness as perhaps it's been portrayed to be. I think there were other structural problems that were there, but again, I go to where Supriya was a moment ago. I think Conservatives really have to look at this and say, all right, how do we address this enthusiasm gap as opposed to how do we game the system to make sure only 60% of people vote? What do we have to do? Because if Conservatives are going to win in the future, they need to change the model a little bit and they need to take a few risks. The criticism I think you could give to Hamish, and he would probably accept it, was they had a low-risk campaign based on some very core things they were going to focus on, and generally they did okay with that, but that limits where you can go.
They essentially wanted the Trudeau Liberals to fail, and they didn't actually do the work, it seems to me, from an opposition research point of view to ensure that fail actually happened. In fact, if you recall the beginning of the campaign, it was the Liberals that had all of the really dastardly bombs on Conservative candidates. And so waiting for your opponent to fail is not a strategy, right? Like you actually have to have a strategy to win. And that's the problem, right? And that means sometimes doing something dramatic in terms of platform, like having something really new and different, as some Conservatives have argued for, on healthcare or on the environment or on the economy, which was basically a neutralized between both the Conservative and the Liberal position.
Okay, I have to leave it there. Thanks to our Power Panel this evening. Appreciate it as always. Supriya Dwivedi, Tim Powers, Kathleen Monk, and Marika Walsh. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.